Great. So let's go ahead and get started. So Dan, you did a lovely introduction, so I don't feel like I have much more to say here about myself, but I will share a little bit about an outline of what we're going to cover during our time together today. So I'm just going to speak briefly, I think probably for about 10 minutes. My aim is not to make you a meditator if you're not a meditator, but maybe to introduce you to some ways of thinking about well-being and the fact that we can actually train well-being as a skill. And this is an insight that's coming out of neuroscience. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. Dan and I will move into more of an informal discussion where I'll take off the slides and he and I will chat. And then I think there might be time for small groups. I imagine this will be organic, so we'll see how it goes. And then we'll continue our time together with some deepening, and then I'll lead us in a closing meditation at the very end. So Dan mentioned a little bit about Healthy Minds Innovations. I want to maybe just add a little bit more detail about what we do in the world, which is that we take the scientific insights that are coming out of decades of neuroscientific research, and we translate these insights into tools to help people both cultivate as well as measure well-being. Our founder is a very sort of famous neuroscientist, and his name is Dr. Richard Davidson. You can see him in the center of the slide here, along with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he has dedicated his life to really understanding flourishing, resilience, and well-being. And everything that we do in the world is really in service of our vision, which is to create a kinder, wiser, more compassionate world. And a part of what we do in addition to education and speaking engagements like this is that we have a free meditation app that's downloadable at your app store. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end of the presentation if you're inspired to learn more about the science of well-being and learn very practical ways to train it. So I would be curious to hear from you, just as we're getting started here, if you would please share with me via chat, what does well-being mean to you? So I'll give you just a moment if you can click on the chat and maybe just share a word, phrase of what well-being means to you. And we'll just see if anyone shares. Okay, health, thank you. Being peaceful and happy, contentment, peace and equanimity, the ability to ride life's waves, being present in everything, the absence of disease, not feeling overwhelmed, a balanced life, confidence, unconditional confidence in one's humanity. Wow. More joy, less stuck, at peace. Wonderful. So lots here in terms of finding balance, peace, and ease in the midst of life. So let me just share with you the way that we're thinking about well-being here. We are taking definitions from the World Health Organization. So one way that we think about well-being is on the left-hand side here. So it's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So one reason why I think that this definition is particularly important is that it extends the view of health beyond just the physical body. So there are a lot of different ways that we can think about well-being that includes the physical, but it also includes things like mental and social well-being. And then on the right-hand side here, there's also an element of what we're talking about here, which is mental health. And so the definition here says a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stressors of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So really this notion of being able to cope with stress, to ride the waves of difficulty, this is all of what we're pointing to here in terms of well-being. So one of the scientific insights that's emerged from the research is the notion that well-being is a skill that can be learned. And this is really the foundation of the Healthy Minds program. So normally when we think about well-being, our well-being is very contingent on our external circumstances, meaning when our relationships are harmonious, we experience well-being. When, life is going well, it's going smoothly, our health is good, we experience well-being. And on the flip side of that, then when times are tough, when we have hardship, when we have illness, when we experience grief and loss, our well-being is compromised. So, what we're pointing to here, actually, in terms of well being as a skill that can be learned, is that we can actually train ourselves to connect with well being, to experience well being in spite of whatever's happening in our lives. Well being is available to us regardless of whether we're well, we're happy, or not. So the science then, some of the scientific questions that we are interested in are what qualities make us more resilient in the face of our challenges? And so we define resilience here as our capacity to bounce back more quickly from adversity. And then on the flip side of that, then we are looking at also what helps us to be at the top of our game when things are going well. We call this flourishing. And so, this notion of well being as a skill that can be learned is really rooted in the science, particularly in the truth of neuroplasticity. So, neuroplasticity is something that maybe you've heard of before, but neuroplasticity simply means that our brains have incredible capacity to change. In fact, our brains are changing all of the time in response to our environment and the world around us. And it's happening unintentionally. And often those changes aren't always positive. So, for example, depending upon your relationship with your cell phone, each time you're picking up your phone and you're habitually checking the news or your social media, you're training your mind more and more to be distracted. So, what we're talking about here is that we're actually harnessing the positive ability for our mind to change in beneficial ways through training in a set of skills that the science points to are beneficial to well being. And I'll talk a little bit about those in just a moment. So there are biological underpinnings to training the mind. So the first is neuroplasticity, which I've already talked about. The second is actually epigenetics. So epigenetics is basically the ways in which our environment and our mental factors interact with our genes and influence the way that our genes are expressed. So you can almost think about genetic expression as like a volume dial um, that turns on or turns up the expression of genes, or there are things that can turn down the expression of genes. So, for example, training the mind using meditation practices is one way that we can influence the way that our genes are expressed. Another biological underpinning then is called innate capacity. We also refer to this as prosociality. And essentially, what this just means is that we as human beings are born with the natural propensity to be kind and caring. And so, of course, then we encounter life circumstances and our upbringing that can kind of shift and change the way that we relate in interpersonal relationships. But as babies, we are born with this propensity to be kind and caring. And so, what we're learning to do as we're training our mind is we're learning to come back to the cultivation or the connection to these kind and caring qualities like appreciation, compassion, and kindness. So there are four different skills here that four different areas of well-being that we train that are related to well-being as a skill and our ability to be resilient and flourish. And these four different areas are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. So I won't go through all of them, but I will just say that this framework of well-being is basically coming from a convergence of themes in different areas like the world's wisdom traditions, Greco-Roman philosophy, positive psychology, as well as Asian meditative traditions. So really a convergence of themes in this area. And the other thing that's important to note here is that the science links these areas or these dimensions to being beneficial to well-being and also indicate that they activate or change different networks in the brain. So science points them to being beneficial to well-being as well. So if you're interested in learning more about our framework of well-being, we have been published in a free research article from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. And so this is a great journal article that you can read a little bit more. Now, I think one of the things that can be really challenging when we think about well-being practices is that we often think that it takes a long time to experience the benefits. And especially in the midst of doing a lot of really good work like you're all doing and volunteering a lot, in the midst of other things that you have going on in your personal life, it can feel like oh man, to like add another well-being practice or another self-care practice onto a very full plate can feel daunting. So I just want to actually highlight a research study here that was done in the midst of the pandemic on a group of school teachers. These school teachers went through a 4-week foundations program from the Healthy Minds Program app. And what was very inspiring is that they saw benefits from practicing 5 minutes a day that sustained 3 months after they were done practicing. And they saw improvements in psychological stress, which is an aggregate of stress, anxiety, and depression. They saw skills associated with well-being, meaning, mindfulness, our ability to be present, cognitive distancing, meaning kind of having distance from our thoughts, just as Dan had led us in the guided meditation, improvements in compassion and social connection, and also just overall well-being. So, in 5 minutes a day, you can experience just a taste of well being and begin that path of training your mind to be able to improve your ability to be resilient as well as your ability to flourish. And so, if you are interested in learning more, you can check out our Healthy Minds program app that is downloadable in the App Store. It's completely free. It's a step-by-step training program for the mind in these different skills associated with well-being. So it's just a little bit about our approach to well-being. And so I'll just stop my screen share here and invite Dan on for a conversation.
Well, thank you very much. If for those of you who are watching the chat, I put in links to the Healthy Minds Innovation, kind of the About page. So that'd be a good entree into finding out more. And then also a link to the app as well. Lots of questions. I think the question that I have first is, how do you think about the relationship between all this and perhaps how it might help us be better activists? And
Yeah.
there's many dimensions to that, so I won't go further. I just wonder what you think
Yeah.
about that question.
Yeah, there are many dimensions to that. I think in terms of activism, I think one of the things that can happen is just being faced with incredible adversity, suffering in the world, and really wanting to make an impact. And so what can arise from that are things like overwork and burnout, uh, empathic fatigue or empathic distress, meaning you're so overwhelmed by the suffering that you're seeing that you're kind of debilitated by the ability to move forward. And there can also be this feeling of not seeing the fruits of your efforts, like, fighting the good fight and then feeling like your efforts are not making a difference, like you're one person that's contributing to, good in the world, but it feels like the path of seeing the fruits from those efforts can sometimes feel yeah, it can feel disappointing maybe. And so what I would say, and so maybe I'll just reflect back, Dan. Does that capture kind of some of the things that you feel like, okay. So um, one of the things that can be really helpful is around this piece of empathic distress. So empathic distress just basically means that when we're faced with constant suffering, we feel overwhelmed by it. We're no longer actually to be motivated to help it. We just feel like we're kind of vibrating on the level of the suffering. So there's been some interesting research in this area which indicates that actually when you train your mind in compassion, you're able to counteract this empathic distress that happens. So there's a difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy is sort of seeing an emotion that someone is having, whether it's positive or negative, and kind of understanding that they're having an emotional experience, in this case, suffering. And then compassion is this kind of motivation to alleviate the suffering. And so, what you can do actually when you're training your mind is you can shift from distress into this motivation to help so that you're not so entangled in the injustices and the context, and you kind of come back to this motivating inspiration to do whatever you can to help however it is. Now sometimes this compassionate motivation is manifests in action. Sometimes it is literally just being with the suffering in a way in which you're not overwhelmed, because when you're overwhelmed with suffering, you're actually you have diminished capacity. So you're wanting to increase your capacity to be with adversity so that you can actually continue to do the good work that you're doing in the world. So that's kind of one thing that comes to mind. The other thing that comes to mind is really around purpose and motivation. So my guess is that you're all here because there's a lot of meaning, there's a lot of purpose in what you're doing. You're interested, there's like you're really wanting to do something because you care about it. And when you experience this doubt or this overwork or this fatigue, you can kind of lose sight of that inspiring motivation. So when you go back to this framework of well-being that I introduced you to, purpose is one of the pillars, and purpose is actually a way in which we're able to connect with a source of meaning that is available to us in spite of our activities. So often when we think about living a meaningful life, we often think that it's our activities that give us meaning. And there is an element of that, of course. But actually, what the science is pointing to is that it's not so much about the activities, it's about the perspective. So the perspective being that you can connect with meaning even when you're doing something mundane like cleaning your cat box. You can connect with meaning when you're, knocking on doors or when you're, cleaning your kids your grandkids diaper. I mean, there you can actually connect with that deeper why. And then when you're connecting with that deeper why, it really allows you to stay motivated, that you're no longer disappointed, you're no longer questioning or doubtful that your efforts are making a difference. So those are just a couple of things. I mean, I clearly could go on and on, but those are just a couple of things that are coming directly to my mind. I think the other thing that I'll just say was the first thing that I had said in terms of the list, was it about stress and overwhelm and burnout?
Mm.
Yes, I think it was.
Yeah, that was in
So,
there. Yeah.
yeah. And so, when we learn to tune in to our thoughts, our emotions, our our energetic reserve in a way that we're conscious of it, we're present with it, we can begin to make wiser decisions around what we're doing. And I think that there can be this way in which we want to say yes to everything because we want to make a difference. And sometimes that diminishes our capacity. So like when we're present with our thoughts and our emotions and our energy, we can say, hey, I actually need to prioritize this thing that's going to make the biggest impact rather than simply saying yes to everything. Because saying yes to everything doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes. Sometimes it compromises your physical health. Sometimes it compromises the quality of what you're doing. And so awareness helps you to really just make better decisions around what you're doing, prioritizing, and just being aware of what you need in terms of your own self-care.
So before I ask more questions, if any folks have questions, put them in the chat. And we will, or if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, I'll just ask if you do uh, ask a question, to just try to be concise with the question. That can be a challenge sometimes. So you said, I mean, a whole lot of things there that I relate to directly in my own personal experience. So first was in this idea of purpose and meaning. And I've absolutely felt that as why I do what I do. But at some point you get to this point of like, well, if you connect purpose and meaning too much to actually accomplishing something, and if we're trying to accomplish solving climate change, you're going to run into a problem there. And even, the smaller level of trying to get certain bills passed or whatever. And so that the meaning and purpose, I think about meaning and purpose quite differently now than I used
Mm.
to.
Hmm.
And it's still there. I still have the drive to do what I do, but I don't think about it anymore in terms of getting something done, although I'm happy. What I really have, it took me forever to figure this out, but where I get my sense of meaning and purpose is being on a call like this, where I'm staring at 50 or 75 people who are here because they care about the things the third act does. And that in community, in our own little different ways, because we're part of a big thing, but we're doing stuff together. And so whether I'm working with a local group that I'm involved in, on climate or state-based groups I'm with a bunch or national group like that, like this. This is what I think about now. And I actually pull that into my meditation practice now because in order to get myself less connected to having, getting something tangible done and being hung up by that. I think about being part of community and the power of community. So I'm wondering if you folks have looked into that, the power of community. I know it's a little different, but is that part of what you do and some of the things you talk to people about?
Yeah, I mean, certainly social connection is widely established as being very important to well-being. And, things like loneliness, I think there was a research study that outlined that loneliness is more detrimental than smoking like 15 cigarettes a day on your overall well-being. So, yes, lots there around the scientific kind of validity around community and social connection being a really important aspect of well-being. When you look at our framework of well-being, you'll see that the second pillar is connection. And there are three kind of different areas that we train there in the area of connection, which are appreciation, kindness, and compassion. And I think you can just think about social connection and the benefits of training it as like breaking down bias. So, we now it's very easy to feel a sense of affinity, warmth, and care for people that we know and for people that we like. And it's much harder to feel warmth and care for strangers and even harder for people that we don't like. And so, what we learn to do actually when we're training our skills in the area of connection is we're learning to tap into this shared humanity that we all experience. And we get, again, so caught up on like the surface level of commonalities or differences that we have a hard time seeing the deeper level of the fact that there are things that we universally as human beings all have in common. Those things are specifically our wish to be happy and our wish to be free from stress, pain, and hardship. Now, the challenge is that the ways that we go about relieving our stress, pain, and hardship are often what I would call confused expressions of loving kindness and compassion. So, one very mundane example of this would be like, let's say you're stressed out, you've had a hard day, you're doing all the hard work, you're exhausted, you want to go home and you eat a pint of ice cream and then you feel terrible, right? So, the motivation that's underneath that is actually to reduce yourself from suffering and to have some ease. But really, the way that you're going about it isn't really the thing that's going to give you lasting happiness. So we learn actually how to come back to this kind of true source of lasting happiness, to connect with our innate appreciation, kindness, and compassion. And we're able to break down bias because we see that we all have this in common. We begin to be able to put ourselves in others' shoes. And we open our hearts in a way that I think is really inspiring, but it does take some training and effort to do so.
There are a couple questions here before I ask the first one. Related to that, can you say a little bit about, so that training is split in at least two ways and maybe much more. One is about the what we did with our little meditation at the beginning, trying to just quiet down and control your own thoughts and your thought process. But then the second piece is thinking about others and thinking about the stories and the biases that are in our heads that we're all born with.
Mm-hmm.
And folks like Daniel Kahneman and so many others have talked about and actually go back to ancient philosophy about these stories that we tell ourselves that aren't so good. So in terms of the training that you do or the app or any other way you want to talk about, how do you kind of uh, point people at those two different pieces, or maybe
Yeah.
there's even more than that? And I know when I came into this, I didn't understand that there was that kind of breakdown and maybe
Mhm.
even more beyond it. So I wonder if you could kind of reflect a little bit more about that, specifically around that there are specific exercises
Yeah.
for specific things, right?
Yeah. 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 So I would say that the essence of what we're doing here in terms of training the mind is all about awareness, which is just our capacity to know what's going on. We can know our thoughts, our emotions. We can, know what's going on in the external world. And it's a knowing actually that is associated with well-being, but it also is just this feeling of being really present with what's happening. And so you begin first by familiarizing yourself with what it feels like to be present. And you learn how to do that a variety of different ways, ranging from following the breath to listening to sound to, paying attention to sensations in your body. And these are all just different ways for you to kind of familiarize yourself with your mind. So it really isn't about the breath, it's about, are you aware of the breath? And then when you're not aware of the breath, coming back. So all of these exercises, it may seem like, what's the benefit of actually watching my breath? But it actually isn't about the breath. It's about whether or not you're present and whether or not you're aware of what's happening, whether or not you're aware that you're breathing. It's just a training method to help you become familiar with that aspect of your mind. And then what we're able to do once we are familiar with this knowing quality of our mind, we can direct it to different aspects of our experience. So we can actually learn to tune in to these natural impulses that we have to move towards well-being, to move towards happiness and ease, which we refer to as kindness, and then move away from suffering, which is compassion. And we learn to see it in ourselves first because we know ourselves best. And then we begin to actually do exercises where we begin to widen our circle of care and concern. So we begin to practice seeing these qualities in our loved ones, opening our hearts to their experience, our pets, our grandchildren, our children, friends, and family. And then we begin to widen the circle even further to include strangers, so people that we don't know, being able to see that even that person that's checking you out at the grocery store, they also want to be happy and free from suffering, and you can remain in connection with them through that shared recognition. And then you move into difficult people, you know. Um, the political landscape right now will give you fodder for years to work with in your practice, but it is possible. And then working to cultivate what we call immeasurable um, love, or I'm sorry, immeasurable kindness and compassion, which just includes all beings. So you do it very systematically. And then the third aspect then is once you've done this, then you begin to work on skills of curiosity, which are called insight. This is when we direct the knowing quality of our mind specifically to investigate our thoughts and our emotions. And we begin to see the way in which our perception, meaning our beliefs, our assumptions, our expectations, create a lot of additional problems for us. So there are things that are create a lot of suffering just naturally in the fact that we experience them. So illness, death, grief, these things are real experiences that cause pain. But then there's a whole layer that we often add to that, which is of our own doing, based on unmet expectations, misbeliefs, assumptions. And so just begin to see how much these create the filter through which we experience the world, and it creates a lot of problems for us. And so then the final area then that we train, it is very much laid out in a step-by-step way, is purpose, where we begin to then harness this knowing quality of our mind awareness through a series of reflections that help us to get familiar with our most deeply held values, to be able to help them be front and center in our experience and our mind as we're engaging in activities, whether it's, the volunteering that you're doing or whether it's just doing your dishes. So connecting with meaning, no matter what you're doing. And in fact, the guided meditation that I'm going to lead you in today is all about finding purpose in adversity. And yeah, so that's a little bit about the way that it's laid out, at least in the program. And if you engage in the app, then the way that it's organized is that there are short podcast style lessons, 5 to 7 minutes long, where you learn about the science of well-being and hear from some of the experts in the field. And then the guided meditations are customizable. So you choose between 5 to 30 minutes. You can do a seated practice or an active practice. The active practices can be done while you're doing some kind of light repetitive activity like house cleaning, gardening, walking, that kind of thing. And then you can also choose your speaking voice. So lots of different options there.
Mm, mm. That's great. I have so much more appreciation for what you're saying, just having stumbled around on this stuff for a few years. But now I think if I'd heard that answer 4 or 5 years ago, I might not have understood it, but I understand it way better now. And part of I'll reflect just because it might be helpful for some of the people here is this idea of and this what you were just talking about and what I learned really I began to really understand how I get triggered, and
Mm-hmm.
whether it's an interaction with a family or somebody cuts me off in traffic, or I hear a speech by certain people who bother me, or whatever, or the fact that this bill that we just worked our butts off on in a given state didn't pass. There are all these things that can trigger you. But now I'm way more aware of, I just am, my antenna is always up for, oh, am I getting triggered now? The response I want to go with is probably totally the wrong one, not always, and to sit back and reflect for a second. And I learned that through the way and the approach you were just talking about, both in understanding my own, what's going on inside me, but then also this idea of compassion for others. We all know that everybody on this call and all the folks who are around us all the time carry loads and bear burdens that we know nothing about,
Mm-hmm.
even the people we dislike the most, and to be kind of having that as in the back of your head. So those are at least just a few personal reflections on, I will say, where I've been able to get to in working with some of the tools and ideas that Stephanie's um, talking about. I'm sure there's many folks on this call who could add other dimensions to it as well. There was one person wrote in about some of the comment before about how to think about the work that you're doing and the actual work rather than the outcome. And it's this idea of right action. So the work that we do is for third act is right action, right? It's what John Lewis was talking about. It's right action. We are taking acts, maybe small steps to do good work in the world. And that's the goal,
Mm-hmm.
as much as anything, or part of it. I'll ask one question here. Are there any findings from the Institute's research and well-being about the impact of time spent outside?
That's a good question. That's not so much, not that I'm aware of. Although I do know that there is research out there that does indicate that being outside is beneficial to well-being. And I think, any of us that have ever spent any time outside probably have experienced those benefits. Is there something that you know of? I actually can't cite any specific research off the top of my head.
Yeah, I know I've seen papers and things on it, but I don't have one at the top of my head. I will know for those of you who are fans of Thich Nhat Hanh, and if you watch videos of him, and so Thich Nhat Hanh was from Vietnam, very famous person in multiple dimensions, but a lot of the when you see him on YouTube and things, a lot of what he talks a lot about walking meditation and being outside and going up to trees and very slowly going through and just being aware of the natural world. So I know there's a lot of people studying it, but I'm not up on the latest.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sylvia writes about a book, I guess, called The Nature Fix by Florence Williams. That might have some of that in there. Um, Sylvia also writes about, she talks about at the end of every day, thinking about the gifts received, the gifts given, and writes them down in her journal. So she's aware of them.
I love that.
So
That's a practice of appreciation. That's lovely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's all about repetitiveness, right? And getting into habit. That's the hard. I've used this phrase before on this call. So it's like going to the gym for my brain.
Yeah.
And just like I have trouble getting myself out and getting exercise every day, but I always feel better when I do it. So it's all about, the huge part is just getting into the habit. I put in the chat again the link to the app, and I also put in a link to the speakers we had last time. If you were here with us, the Reflections of Life folks, and I put that here because I think that relates a lot to what we're talking about here. So if you go to the Reflections of Life site, and they have these little websites, beautiful little websites, beautiful little videos, 5-10 minutes, and that's exactly what people are talking about. Is what Stephanie was talking about before, is how people think about their own internal what's going on, but then also the external world. And I find those really helpful in when I'm kind of stuck. I just go watch them and then I do a little 20-minute meditation about them. Just wonderful, lovely, wise people from around the world. So Stephanie and I are going to talk a little bit more, and then Stephanie's going to lead us in a guided closing meditation. While she's doing that, I'm going to put a few more things into the chat. So before we leave at 7:30, you might want to go through there and look at some of those links. If you just click on the link within the chat, it's going to pop up in your browser, so you'll have it there um, for future use. So we wanted to switch gears a little bit. You got an incredibly high-speed introduction to the work that Stephanie's part of and some of the things that group, amazing group, is creating. But we wanted to come at it a different way now and do a little bit more of what I've been doing, but hear it from Stephanie's point of view. So, what her personal experience here. And the point of that being, I will say for myself personally, I began to meet certain people when I was on this journey, and I still meet them today. And I think that is a different person. That person has attained something. So this is real and true, what people talk about, whether it's from the different wisdom traditions or from science. There's a million different ways to come at this, but there are wise people walking around in the world. And I say you can tell when you meet them. And I think Stephanie's one of them. So I wanted to see, Stephanie, if you could tell us a little bit more about your personal experience. And let's start with what drew you into this whole world? What drew you into meditation, contemplation, and this work?
A lot of suffering. Yeah, so I started practicing over 20 years ago, and I had a very kind of high level corporate job. I was traveling a lot for a living, and I had a lot of anxiety. We're talking like chronic, sort of debilitating anxiety. And I was trying to just make myself better, feel better through doing a lot of things that were not at all aligned with my values and were also not good for me, ranging from eating too much, drinking too much, shopping too much, just kind of like consuming all the things. And I kind of just reached a point where I was like, this has to stop. And I had a kind of a notion that there had to be a different way. And so I just started exploring meditation. I grew up a child of a yogi, like she still does yoga. She's 77 years old, very inspiring. And yeah, so it was, something that I had been introduced to as a concept, but never in a practice. And so I just sought out meditation, took to the practice immediately, and just became a very serious meditator. And so much so that I ended up leaving my corporate job in 2018 to come and work for Healthy Minds Innovations for significantly less money, but a lot more meaning and a lot more joy. And I look back now on the Stephanie that was deeply, deeply anxious and over consuming. And I am just like a completely different person. So I think the path is not often as we think it's going to be. I think we come to these practices with a lot of expectations around immediate benefits, but it really is the long haul. Honestly, you may have moments of calm, moments of peace, but you'll also have moments where you're faced with a lot of your mind doing all the things that are really painful, like rumination and self-judgment and whatever it is, whatever your habitual tendency is, you're going to be facing that. But you get to learn how to develop a different relationship to it. So rather than having it be your enemy, you get to befriend it, see that it's just transitory. And yeah, I would say it's just been an incredibly powerful journey for me for just dealing with my anxiety and really getting a handle on it.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks for telling us that. That's very helpful. How as you were started on that journey, which angle of it began to resonate with you? Was it more in your head or your heart that you began to feel like, oh, there's something here, or was it both?
Hmm. Definitely the heart. I think the kind of like intellectual side of the practice I've always just like struggled with. I think intellect only gets you so far. I mean, you have to have an intellectual understanding of what you're doing just so that you know how to do it. But I think it's in the actual experiential doing that you will see the most benefit. So it's interesting because we've actually done some research on the Healthy Minds program, and we've looked at, will someone actually experience well-being from just listening to the podcast lessons, or do they need to do the practices? And I think the preliminary research shows that you do experience like a little benefit in the lessons, but without doing the practice, but it's transitory. It doesn't sustain. Whereas when you actually get the experiential understanding of doing the actual practices, that is what sustains through time to improve your well-being. So I
Mm,
would say for me personally, it's been very much about the heart and the feeling like this is a pursuit to me that's worthy and meaningful. And, I just remember my husband coming to me after I'd been meditating for several years. He's like, "You are a different person. I want what you're doing." And so I taught him how to meditate, and now he's also a meditator. So, yeah.
that's cool. That's the proof's in the pudding.
Yeah,
Do you,
exactly.
do you, do you come from, we didn't talk about this before, but the question just popped into my head. Do you come from a particular religious or spiritual tradition as a kid? And
Yeah.
did that have any impact one way or another on all this?
Yeah, so I grew up as Lutheran, confirmed as Lutheran, and went to church, pretty much up until I graduated from high school, and then stopped going to church. And I don't really know why. And I remember when I went to church, I did feel a sense of like spiritual connection. But yeah, there's something that really shifted for me in the worldview, which is one in which my personal belief and my spiritual belief is that we're not broken. We actually are innately and inherently pure, whole, complete, perfect, just as we are. We just kind of lose connection with that innate wholeness. And so through the practice of meditation, we just learn how to come back to that innate wholeness that exists within us. But what I will say is that, of course, there are spiritual traditions in which meditation is at the forefront, like Buddhist practices and a lot of Hindu practices. But the Healthy Minds program is stripped of any kind of religious underpinnings. It really is completely secular. And that's why we've gone to a lot of effort in researching well-being, because you can actually be a Christian, you can be a Jew, you can be a Hindu, and you can be a Sufi, you can be all the things, any religious, preference that you have, you can integrate these practices into your current religion, spiritual tradition, and you will benefit. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Yeah, one of the reasons I asked that question was, I was raised as a Roman Catholic and, walked away from that. And then in more recent times, as part of this whole thing, I've really kind of gone at this from a science point of view, a secular point of view, a philosophy point of view, a religious point of view, and come to learn that these things that you're talking about, many of us would recognize them as being traditions, as you said, related to the Buddhist.
Hmm.
In particular, that's what people talk about. But it turns out all the religious traditions
They
have them.
do.
They all
Yeah.
do, which was a
Contemplative
complete
prayer.
shock.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Kabbalah, and on and on. And it's so interesting because they're kind of all saying very similar things, and the practices of what you were talking about before resonated in the idea that listening, actually doing the practices is required because you need that repetition. There's something in that
Yeah.
repetition. And that goes all the way back for thousands of years. And now the science is starting to show that there could be connections to that, to the actual rewiring and the neuroplasticity and
Yeah.
epigenetics and stuff. So the science is really coming in alignment with these joint ideas. And I come at it, I'm a more head guy, I'm a scientist in my original training. And so I'm learning to listen with my heart. But both of those things I've begun to realize, well, it depends on your personality and,
Yeah.
what works for you. And if you resist one, that probably means you should go right at
Yeah.
it, because there's probably something there that you're missing.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
others have told that to me.
Yeah.
Um, can you say a little bit about what is your daily practice? What's turned out to work for you? And also, does it stay the same, or you change it a lot, or how's that work?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, so what I'm about to say is, so just remember, I'm like a career meditator, okay? So just keep that in mind. So my formal practice is I practice 90 minutes in the morning, And sometimes, depending upon how I'm feeling physically, I have rheumatoid arthritis, which can sometimes impact my ability to sit for long periods of time. Sometimes I'll sit the whole time. Sometimes I'll break it into, like an hour of sitting and then an hour of walking, meditation outside. So really depends a little bit on how my physical body's doing. Um, and I do a particular set of practices. I am just going to be honest, I am a Buddhist, so I'm just going to put that on the table. But yeah, so my practice that I do is kind of a blending of Buddhist practice and non-Buddhist practice. And so then there's also this way in which I set the intention to practice in daily life. So, of course, formal practice is important, but we can also sprinkle short moments of practice throughout our day. And yeah, so I do that. So you can choose basically a daily activity that you do throughout your day, like walking to the bathroom, drinking water, whatever it may be. And then you just set that intention as a short moment of practicing being present. And you're kind of rewiring your mind then short moments throughout your day. And then I would say that my practice has changed significantly through time in that there have been periods in my life where I've had a lot of life circumstances that have been really difficult. And one that particularly comes to my mind most recently is my father died during the pandemic. He had 6 months in and out of transitional care. It was just like the worst kind of suffering. And so I was not only dealing with the pandemic, but I was also dealing with trying to care for him and be with him and knowing that he was dying. And once he died, I had so much grief, like I just could not meditate. It was really painful. He was my special person, so to lose him was very painful. So I actually started drawing. I had never drawn ever, but I would
Hmm.
sit down on my meditation cushion and I would watch these children's videos of like drawing these like bacon and eggs with little googly eyes uh, and other things. And I just start drawing, but I do it as a mindfulness practice. And so, you kind of have to meet yourself wherever you are. So if you want to do mindful knitting, mindful walking, lots of things can be beneficial in your practice. You just kind of have to work with what feels workable because you don't want to push yourself to be with something that doesn't feel workable. And so my grief at that time just didn't feel workable.
Hmm. Yeah, I've also heard people say that even if something is working well for you, and maybe you don't have an event like that, which I was sorry to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Um,
It's inevitable. No one gets out alive.
yeah, but during COVID, I mean,
Yeah,
we
it
probably
was
all
rough.
there are probably a lot of stories here.
Yeah.
That was hard, hard, hard. Um, but just this idea that you get stuck, or something might just not work for you, and
Yeah.
and that's okay. And actually, that's probably a sign of some growth. And so take it in that realm and try
Yeah.
something new and different. Had this conversation with a good friend of mine and who I talked to a lot about these things. And I really couldn't do the sit anymore. He said, well, just try, walking meditation, just movement. And I've started to do that and hugely helpful. And also just spending time in nature. Going back to the question before, one can, I spend a lot of time reflecting on just the beauty of nature. And,
Mhm.
I mean, the miracles, I read a lot of science, about the brain and the body. And there are writers who are saying last century was the century of physics. This is going to be the century of biology. And what they're finding out about, and we talked a little bit here about neuroplasticity and epigenetics and things like that. It's unbelievable. Our bodies are miracles. Each of us, it's a miracle that each of us, any of us are sitting
True.
here. I'll tell
It's
you,
true.
one study said that the odds that Dan Quinlan, was born is the same as the odds of me getting hit by a bolt of lightning in this chair 2,700 times on the same day. So the
Whoa.
odds that we're all here are ridiculously low, and our bodies are incredible. And you begin to reflect on that, and you see birds and things. So I've been able to, that would be one of my hooks for me that's worked into the heart aspect of it. Just the beauty and amazingness of that. So
And
with that,
I just want to jump in really quick and just
yeah.
reaffirm something that you said, which is that there are so many different types of practices. There's so many different types of people with so many different types of personalities and preferences. Like, just do what works for you. You're going to be introduced to a buffet of choices. Whether you go to another app or another program or you decide to do a Healthy Minds program. And so, you know, It's not, it isn't really that you need to do every single one, but like really start with where it resonates. And then when it starts feeling not so fresh, then move on to something else, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's probably a lot more people around you doing these things that you don't know about, and they
Yeah.
might not even call it a formal practice or whatever,
Yeah.
but they do it in their own way. So it's kind of
Yeah.
fun to ask people what they do. Some of
Yeah.
people give you a weird look, and others, love that that door has been open to have that conversation. So thank you. We're going to wrap up. I'm going to do a little tiny wrap up at the end, but we're going to spend the
Okay.
next few minutes with Stephanie leading us in a guided meditation. So I'll
Great.
turn it back to you.
Okay. So I thought that I'd lead something from the pillar of purpose and specifically seeking meaning in difficult experiences. So often difficult experiences are so overwhelming. Um, it's good to see if we can find meaning in the difficulty. So you can do this actually as a guided reflection, just in terms of like jotting down some journaling prompts, things that are coming up for you, or you can just, do it silently in your mind, however it works the best for you. So go ahead and just find a posture that you feel like is supportive to your well-being. Generally, you just think about having the spine loosely straight and relaxing the muscles in your body, even if it's just a little bit. And you can choose to practice with your eyes closed or open with a soft gaze in front of you. And just take a couple of slow, mindful, deep breaths here to ground yourself in the practice. Each out breath allows us to relax a little bit and settle into this quality of simple presence. And so, next, just bring to mind a meaningful challenge, something from your life that you felt like helped you learn and grow. And maybe not the most difficult thing you've ever faced. Just choose something maybe a little bit smaller than the most challenging thing. And just think back to that time that led to a positive change for you. And once you've identified that difficult situation, see if you can remember how it felt meaningful in some way, maybe after the fact, maybe years later. How did it lead to something positive? How was this significant for you? So just bring some of that to your mind. Maybe it was instrumental in changing a relationship, changing your behavior, or some sort of course of direction in your life. Did anything meaningful happen as a result of this? So just continue your exploration here. When we're in the moment, sometimes it's hard to find meaning in the difficulty, but later we look back and see the lessons learned. We can see how we're stronger, how the choices that we made had some kind of positive result. So just think about what are some of the lessons learned from this situation. So now we're going to actually evolve our thinking here, and we're going to apply what we've learned from this previous challenge into a challenge that you're currently facing. So think about something that you're faced with right now. Again, not the most challenging thing, but just bring like a challenging situation to your mind. And how might you change, how might you approach this challenge with what you learned from your current lesson, your previous difficulty? How can you frame this challenge in a different way? We're just shifting our perspective here to view this situation through the lens of learning and meaning. Perhaps it's that you've got incredible strength and capacity that you didn't know before. Perhaps you learned how to not navigate conflict differently. Just bring a couple of things to mind here. Okay, and then you can just let go of the practice and allow your mind to rest for a moment. There's no need to pay attention to anything in particular, but you're also not lost, so you're just present. You might notice any impact of the reflection. Maybe it brought up some feelings in you, and that's okay too. Part of this practice is just welcoming whatever arises in our mind and in our hearts. Okay, if your eyes have been closed, you can open them, and we'll come out of our practice.
Thank you, Stephanie. If you'd like, folks, if you'd like to pop a word or two into the chat about what that felt like, be interesting to see what flies by. And after that's done, after some of those go by, I'm gonna put in a link that Stephanie gave me to some guided meditations via SoundCloud. So I won't close the call down immediately, so you'll be able to grab that. And then there's also links in here again to the app, to the Healthy Minds Innovation site. And I'm gonna put a link into one of the papers that was talked about and as well in a moment. Actually, I'll do that now. At least I'll find it. So I've got it. There it is. So thank you, Stephanie, so much. Really